My name is Dr. Gerard Puccio. I am chair and professor in the Creative Studies Department, International Center for Studies in Creativity at Buffalo State, which is part of the State University of New York. How's that for a long title? Over the next 10 minutes, what I'd like to do is overview for you some of my research interests. Before I jump into that, though, I'll preface this brief presentation with a couple comments. As I reflect on research, I'm reminded of something that my doctoral supervisor, Reg Talbot, shared with me, which is if you're going to do research, you have to be willing to subject your own self to that research. And so one of the reasons why these areas are of interest to me is because I struggle with these questions. I reflect on these questions. So part of this journey is really trying to answer some very deep questions that I have inside of myself. The second point I'd like to make before I go into the specific topics is that as I describe my research interests, please know that much of this comes through collaboration. We're very fortunate at the International Center for Studies in Creativity to have a team of faculty members who work together on various research projects, as well as we have the opportunity to have students join us in our research. So please don't interpret this as strictly Gerard Puccio's research agenda, but it's very much a collaborative research agenda. So on the first slide, there's some icons here. Some may be familiar to you, some may not. In the lower left-hand corner is a gentleman who is a leading theoretician and research mind in leadership. That's James McGregor Burns. So one of the areas of interest that I have is looking at the relationship between creativity and leadership. In the center icon is an image of a tool, an assessment tool that I've designed and work with a number of individuals to extend the use of this tool called foresight. So I'll go into my research interests, specifically focusing on foresight. And then in the lower right-hand corner, those of you familiar with the field of creativity may recognize these two individuals. It's a photograph of the two founding faculty members of our department, Dr. Sidney Parnes and Dr. Ruth Noller. Now, I'm going to review my areas of interest in sort of reverse order with what's most current or more recent, and then go back to working backwards to the more long-standing areas of interest. So the most recent area of focus for me and curiosity is around creativity and leadership. I'll highlight just a few specific areas within this topic that I'm curious about. First of all, I'm very much intrigued by understanding the overlap, not the degree to which they're synonymous, but the overlap between creativity and leadership, and begin to understand why and how creativity, creative problem solving, creative thinking are important to leadership today in the 21st century. How does it serve leaders with respect to being a core leadership skill? This interest goes back to reading in the leadership literature and looking at inferences, references, implicit comments made about creativity and concepts, skills, abilities that we would recognize from the creativity field as being well known, well documented in the field of creativity, but being mentioned as important from the perspective of those doing leadership research. I think that the two fields are in some ways beginning to converge, and I'd like to facilitate that process by building more explicit bridges between leadership and creativity. Why? Because if leadership research and leadership theoreticians are calling on aspects of creativity and saying, gosh, these are important. Leaders today are really good at sensing opportunities. They're adept at developing a vision. Well, gosh, these are aspects of the creative personality that have been discussed for many decades now. So the opportunity is, if these are being called on by those in leadership studies, and we have many decades of research in the field of creativity, then it seems to me that by building more formal bridges, we can mutually reinforce one another. And so that's an area of interest that I have. Second area, extending it a bit further, and this comes from recent conversations with Sue Keller-Mathers and Mary Murdoch, Marie Mance, Jeffrey Zacko-Smith, our newest faculty member, and that is, it seems as though there's a new not new creativity, but a new leadership term that comes up almost with every season. In the spring, the Harvard Business Review published a journal article on leadership in crisis. What did they call it? Adaptive leadership. And a number of months ago, Marie Mance, Jeffrey Zacko-Smith, and I were at a conference, and we heard a keynote presenter talk about the concept of global leadership. How do you influence others in a global organization? And so the area of leadership, much like creativity, is sometimes carved up into more specific concepts. And so we're toying with the notion, does it make sense? Is it reasonable to think about a concept known as creative leadership, which is influencing your context by bringing new ideas to fruition? Is that a way of framing leadership by specifically focusing on the deliberate intent to bring something new into existence and positively influence your context, whether it be a school, your classroom, your department, an organization, an entire community, or some larger context. We've just recently collected some research on this. Dr. Zacko-Smith and I have begun to go through some of the data together with Mary Murdoch and Marie Mance. What we hope to do is to take stories that people have shared with us, personal experiences where they've witnessed very effective leaders face some daunting challenges, and through their skill sets or knowledge, interpersonal skills, we're able to bring change about. So we're beginning to document stories and just starting to look at these stories to see if we can distill from that a concept that is easily framed around this notion of creative leadership. One further area with respect to this connection between creativity and leadership, and I've sort of alluded to this with the comment that I just made, going a little further, is to identify what specifically are the qualities that are associated with creative leadership, and can we assess those? Feedback is the breakfast of champions. We grow through feedback. If we're about, and I would argue that our graduate program in large part is about helping people to go out and influence their world in new and different ways to bring about change, that if we can identify what are the qualities of creative leadership and we can reliably and validly assess those qualities, then we can assist our students and others to grow into even more effective creative leaders. Okay, I'll jump to foresight. Foresight is a psychometric tool, self-report measure, developed in the early 1990s. As we continue to look at foresight, there are new questions that have come up, areas of interest, so I'm going to only describe some of the newer areas of interest. One that I've been working on over the last couple years, I've been able to partner with a former student and a current student to look at this particular area, and that is developing a deeper understanding of the personality traits associated with the foresight preferences. So if you're not familiar with foresight, foresight looks at the link between a person and their expression of preferences within the creative process. So degrees of preference for clarifying, ideating, developing, and implementing, the four fundamental areas of the creative process. So in a way, we've personalized the creative process. In some ways, this connects to the work that Mary Murdoch and Marie Mance and I initiated, looking at the connection between creativity and leadership, positioning, creative problem solving as a core leadership skill, and specifically looking at the affective dispositions that lie below creative problem solving efforts. So beyond cognition and thinking through a task, making change also requires highly honed affective skills as well. So foresight, as a measure of cognitive preferences, gives us an opportunity to correlate this tool with personality measures, so we can begin to unpack what's the personality composition of a clarifier, an ideator, developer, and implementer, and so forth. In fact, I'm going to share with you some research around this. Next slide shows some correlations between foresight and the DISC personality profile, very popular measure used in management circles, leadership training. I'm going to highlight just some of the correlations, not going to go through all of them, but if we look at clarifier and conscientiousness, we see a positive correlation, which would indicate clarifiers will express these personality traits. They adhere to rules, structure, ask questions, focus on the details. Ideator correlates with steadiness. It's a negative correlation, which says that high ideators will exhibit traits that are opposite of steadiness. So they're comfortable with change. In fact, they desire change. They challenge the paradigm. They like and they seek variety. When we look at developer, we see it correlates with the conscientious scale on DISC. The traits, again, associated with that are careful, exacting, accurate, cautious. Makes sense if you're going to be developing a solution. It makes sense that you would have those personality traits. And last example, clarifier correlates in a negative fashion with influence, which, according to DISC, would indicate that clarifiers persuade others through facts rather than feelings. They try to convince you by showing you the data or sharing information with you. So what this does is it helps us to understand, in a way, what the personality profile is of each foresight preference, but it also helps us understand the creative process. So when you're clarifying, do you have to adopt a different personality? Do you have to adopt a different mindset? And does that need to become part of our training? We're also curious about foresight in other languages. We're often asked to have foresight translated into other languages. So we want to continue that process in terms of making sure that it works in an appropriate fashion in other languages. Understanding foresight in relationship to demographics, occupation, and function. Almost every time I deliver foresight to audiences, they'll ask me, does my profile predict what occupation I'm going to pursue? Well, we've collected some data on that, and we're about to analyze that. And I'll go to the last area, efficacy of creative problem solving. So the longest standing area of interest, does creative problem solving work? I've been training and teaching in this area for 19 years, and I think it's good often to stop and say, what's the effect of what I'm doing? Is this making any difference? An area that I think we should be joining the conversation in. There's been great debate in the literature about the effectiveness of brainstorming. We've not necessarily participated in that debate. I think the discussion's been too narrowly defined. It hasn't looked at broader impact and value of brainstorming, so that's an area that I'd like to see us move into. Provide evidence in regard to the impact of creative problem solving and creative leadership training inside of organizations. And in fact, I'll share with you some research. This is very recent work, in fact, conducted over the summertime, and this will be the last slide I take you through. I've been working with Nate Schwagler. He started this project when he was a student. Now he's a graduate of our program.
He's actually on the web listening.
Is
so
he?
Say hi to Nate.
Hey, Nate. A shout out to Nate Schwagler. So I'm glad I mentioned Nate's name since I'm citing his work. I've been doing training inside of a multinational organization. We've been training managers in a creative leadership program, 2-day workshop followed by a year-long professional development program. And Nate conducted in-depth interviews of 15 of the participants from 4 different cohorts took this program over a 5-year period. He has 280 pages of narrative data. I'm going to share with you just some of the preliminary findings that he's come up with. First of all, there seems to be a uniformed increase in confidence in their roles as leaders and influencing others. An application of creative problem solving and creative leadership to risk identification and mitigation. Where are the risk areas? How do we avoid those areas? Acknowledging and overcoming emotional-based decision-making. Not that emotions aren't a positive thing, but if it's the only thing driving a decision, it needs to be balanced off, and folks are finding that helpful. This I find intriguing, the development of micro-creativity cultures, a term that Nate came up with. We've been training cohorts over a 4-year period or so, and now as a result of some 60 people going through this training, they're starting to gravitate towards each other. When they're in meetings and they're engaging in problem solving, a number of them will immediately slip into creative problem solving and be able to reinforce one another. So I like this notion of these micro-creativity cultures, and I think if you're going to create a revolution, you first start with these micro-creativity cultures. And then the last, we've been looking for what are the bottom line outcomes, and Nate's been able to track using critical incident stories some specific monetary returns. So given his calculations, $4.75 million in cost savings, new sales, projected new sales, and operating expense reduction that can be directly attributed to the Creative Leadership Workshop.